When you ask your customer questions in any type of survey, do something about it and tell them somehow, whether it's something on your website or if it's something else in any of your communications, we heard this from you, we're doing something about it.
It's time for CX education. Welcome to the podcast for enterprise CX professionals, the people who want to connect with customers on their own terms, before, during, and after a purchase is made. In each episode, you'll learn how to create experiences your customers love. Ready? Here we go.
Hello, this is Heather Scher, and welcome to another podcast on customer experience, so CX education. And today I'm super excited about the guest we have. So this is a person that kind of near and dear to my heart. It practices something. I'm really excited. And her name is Sandra Thompson. She is with Ei Evolution. And Ei Evolution brings a bold experience to people in customer experience roles and to businesses in order to help them grow their emotional intelligence within their organization. Hopefully I got that right, Sandra.
Spot on.
Maybe not quite as eloquent as you probably know it, but that's okay. So I want to start off a little bit about where we got to, or where you got to. Tell me a little bit about how you got into this space. How did you get to where you are today? And a little bit about Ei Evolution. What does that mean?
Okay, we're going to go for the abridged version. Otherwise, we could be here for quite a long time. So I actually started out life in marketing. And one of the things that I did was a master's in strategic communications. Part of that course required me to write a dissertation. And at that point, Daniel Goleman's book about emotional intelligence hadn't been out all that long. It was one of those, the title was really compelling. It was something along the lines of, you didn't need IQ to be hugely successful, you needed EQ. And I was like, I've got to read this because I'm not sure where my IQ is, but if there's something that I can develop to smash it, then I've got to be in this game. So I chose to research emotional intelligence. I wrote this master's dissertation on it, and I thought there's something going on in this space. And then I carried on with my career. And 20 years later, I was invited to write a TEDx and deliver a TEDx. And I thought, I've got to go back to EI. I've got to go back to emotional intelligence because it's bound to have matured a huge amount in this time. And I went back to my books, and obviously there's far more on the internet these days, and found myself researching it for about 3 or 4 months, just for a 13-minute slot. And there it was. That's where emotional intelligence fit in my life. I then chose to go off and become a coach in it, which meant not only from a theoretical perspective did I understand it, I understood it from a practical perspective because I'd been trained by Goleman himself, Daniel Goleman, who wrote this book that I came across years ago, and his faculty. So it has been an incredible journey, because in actual fact, when I started in marketing, I was obsessed with people and how they behaved and why they did the things they did. And about 14 years ago, when I moved then into the customer experience space, I thought, you know what, there's even more we can do to try and influence and understand people. So I kind of moved from marketing to CX with that little line of emotional intelligence going on throughout. And more recently, I've been doing a lot more work in the employee experience space, because after all, you can't have good customer experiences without employees feeling good about themselves and the work that they're doing. I think that's the majority of the story. The only other thing to add in is that I do a bit of teaching. So I teach young people things like people management and leadership. And I also do things like try and teach them emotional intelligence, which is fascinating because at the age of 18, their prefrontal cortex hasn't developed properly yet, but it's always worth a go.
Wow. Yeah, I was thinking about that. Like how can they intellectually kind of receive that, right?
Well, I mean, even from a perspective of knowing that if they can gather emotional self-awareness, they will build resilience, adaptability, positive outlook. I think they found that quite a attractive proposition, knowing that they need to have particular characteristics to be effective in the business world. So I definitely grabbed their attention from that perspective. As far as actually getting them to journal every day to build that emotional awareness, that was obviously another thing altogether. But this EI evolution bit is as you described it at the very start, Heather. It's about trying to help people grasp what emotional intelligence is and to invest in that skill, because I think all of us know those people that we like to work with and those that we don't really like so much. And we know as well where we are productive and where we do amazing work. And I know that it will come down to very often emotional connection. And that's really what emotional intelligence is all about.
So, and I find that fascinating. So then, did I hear you correctly? And when you were in marketing, were you running your own business at the time, or were you working for a business where you then focused on and got this education in emotional intelligence and then were able to do something internally at the company you were working for and then branched out? I'm actually curious to hear more about that.
So it's a great question. So actually, I worked for a regional authority when I did my master's degree. And what I found when I was doing that particular master's is that my whole view on what marketing was and its purpose changed dramatically within that time. So, yes, I was employed. They paid for my master's because I wanted to do more academically. I was, it's a bit of a funny, well, it's not really that funny actually at all, but I didn't enjoy education all that much when I was much younger. But as I got older, I had this real thirst and desire to go and learn. It was like I was a late developer or a late interested. I don't quite know whether any of that makes sense to anyone listening, but I kind of got to my late 20s, early 30s, and I was really desperate to learn from really amazing people in a university. So as I say, I went off to do this master's degree. I was employed at that point. I actually quit that job once I got my master's and went around the world on my own, and then came back with having kind of like digested what that whole learning experience was, which meant that when I came back to the UK, I knew that I needed to do more in the emotional intelligence space. So I think it drew me to a number of kind of transformational projects when I was still employed. While I wouldn't say I'd recognize right now that I was trying to bring emotional intelligence in, that's actually what I was doing. I didn't realize it at the time, but that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to understand how people were wired, and I was trying to understand the differences between people. And in actual fact, I work for a charity. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a big UK charity. They look after houses and countryside. They're called the National Trust. And I worked there, and we did this enormous program around customer insight. And it was all of the types of things that I talk to companies about now, which is people's values, their behaviors, and their emotions. Because I'm sure you know that almost 97% of the decisions that we make in life are emotional. And while
Mhm.
people will say, yeah, well, actually, no, I think you're wrong because I was very rational about my list of things that I wanted to get. Sorry, I think you'll find you're wrong because that's a post rationalization of the decision you've made. So I think I may have answered that question, Heather, in a bit of a roundabout way. But the long and short of it is I did my master's when I was employed. I went off around the world for a year. I came back and I was still working for about 7 or 8 years in companies, working out how I could use this underlying skill. I mean, it was only really when I worked for myself, it really came to the fore, and I was using it with clients.
Got it. Yeah. So yeah, it was just curious. My thought is for the listeners, that this might be really new for them. Or maybe they've thought, how do we change the game of what we're doing in business, right? And we've got to change it up. And this sounds like a really great idea, but we have no idea how to zone in and what is the success rate, of them being able to get this project. So I was kind of curious. I mean, it sounds like you did start having in your employer, you were able to start taking the skills that you learned from all of this emotional intelligence master training, right? And kind of apply that.
Mm.
But it necessarily wasn't called that, it sounds like, at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So then a couple things I'm taking away from this. Maybe you can kind of help our listeners a little bit understand if they've never heard of emotional intelligence, let's say, help us understand kind of what it is at a high level and humanistic level, but then how it relates to businesses.
Really great question. So there are, as you would expect, dozens of different definitions out there as to what emotional intelligence is. I'm still a fan of the Goldman definition, so I'm gonna give you that, which is the ability to recognize and understand your own emotions, therefore enhancing your ability to understand the emotions of others, with the outcome of being able to manage how you show up and how you develop meaningful relationships. Now, that's not a direct quote, but that's my take from what this work is all about. Because ultimately, in business, how we show up will determine the type of work we do, the way we do it, and who we get the best out of. And if you think about any kind of organization, you have a whole variety of people working in teams or working on projects with different types of people. You're coming in and out of projects. You're working with suppliers. You're working with partners. They all have their own emotional DNA. And what I mean by that is we all feel things differently. We all attach different meanings to different experiences. Now, if I were to put a picture in your mind of a desert island, every single one of us would come up with a different first word as to what we think when we first see that picture, dependent on our experiences, what's front of mind. I show a picture of a desert island to my clients sometimes. Some people use freedom. Another one says holiday. Another one says too hot. We all see things in a completely different way. And when we are able to understand what's going on with ourselves, then we can properly be present for other people. That sounds so simple, right? But how many times have you worked with someone who is not listening? Is worse than not listening. They're finishing off your sentences because they're listening to respond, not listening to be present. How many times have you been misunderstood? How many times have you felt conflict when there really wasn't any there, but it suddenly is turned into that? Now, when you have the skill of emotional intelligence, you can check in with yourself and you can decide whether what you're feeling is good for you or whether it could be detrimental to the relationship you have. Now, when I was being taught how to coach, I was taught to sit in the emotion that I was feeling. So just imagine this for a second. I'm going about my day, everything's pretty average, and then an email pops up. I read the email. Whoa, what was that? I can feel myself get agitated. Now I'm not agitated, I'm angry. Now I'm not angry, I'm furious because someone has said something that has triggered me. And then I've got a decision. I used to send that message back. Bah, 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 boom. And that's it. The damage is done. They might come back and say, I never intended it to be like that. or they might come back and it gets escalated. And then before you know it, you're having to meet with them to unpick whatever that was. So the definition of emotional intelligence being about you first, and then your ability to connect with others is fundamentally critical. Because if you don't know how you're feeling and you don't have the ability to manage how you're showing up, you will never be able to properly empathize with others.
So I think what you've just said is so true in whether it's a personal life, right? Personal relationship, and also professional, obviously, as you mentioned, professional relationships. And maybe you can tell the listeners from a business perspective a little bit more about how this relates or impacts business. Like even the last thing that you said about the story of the email, I find those things have gotten worse since COVID because all of us are working at different times and we're working remotely, right? So there's so much misunderstood, I feel like sometimes. So I've seen an increase since the pandemic with misunderstanding just because we're relying more and more because we're all like rushing because the meetings we do have, we don't have time to actually talk to our coworkers all the time if we're meeting with customers and things like that. So help the listeners understand a little bit of the things that you would help them to try to achieve for their business and as it relates to emotional intelligence.
So I'm going to give some specific examples for a second. So one of the things that's been coming up a lot recently is a thing called productivity paranoia. So what this is where you have a manager who is not over keen on their team working remotely or hybrid, because if they can't see them, they don't trust that the work is being done. Now, the staff are actually getting the work done. So the issue isn't with the staff, it's with the manager and how they are feeling. That's the fact. So, my suggestion, my encouragement, my invitation is that for managers, should they develop the skill of emotional intelligence, they would be able to recognize the emotions that are coming up for them, which is the reason why they are paranoid that their team is not doing the work, not showing up, not to be trusted, etc., etc. And if they really sat in that, they would be able to distinguish between fact and imagination. Because the amazing thing about our species is that we have the most imaginative minds, and that if something isn't certain, we make it up. So if someone says that they might be online at this time and they're not, if they perhaps said that they'd get something done by this time and they didn't, automatically we're going towards well, they're obviously out shopping or they've gone to the beach, rather than actually they've just incurred these particular things. You just need them to communicate with you to let you know. So have that conversation with them about reciprocal communication and update, and then you'll find that the fear you are experiencing will be reduced. Many managers are demanding that staff have to come in to the office just for them to feel more calm and more secure. It's a nonsense. Managers need to learn the skill of emotional intelligence to be honest and fair and reasonable to their hardworking teams. And honestly, if you really don't trust a person, why did you recruit me in the first place? So that's one example. Another thing is around innovation, collaboration. Some of the most amazing inventions, the most amazing ideas come from diverse groups. And the ability to be open, to be curious, to ask great questions, and to recognize our biases is through the skill of emotional intelligence, where you basically sense something and you question it about yourself. So you might jump to a conclusion about something. I mean, the fact is our brains are lazy. We have this thing called system 1 and system 2. This is the work of Daniel Kahneman. I'm sure those guys that have tuned in will know about this work, thinking fast and slow. Our brains are instantly jumping to conclusions because we want to get to a result really quickly. Now, that's helpful because we can't cogitate over everything. We just would never get anything done. But with the skill of emotional intelligence, you're more likely to be more welcoming. You're more likely to have a growth mindset than a fixed mindset, which means that you can really ideate, you can properly collaborate because you're not closing someone down with your judgment. You're using open language to get them to say more rather than to close them down with a particular language which might give them the signal that you don't agree or it's not acceptable. I'm hoping that some of this makes sense. It makes sense in my head, but sometimes it doesn't always when it comes out of my mouth. But the point here is that diversity and innovation and ideas come from a place where people can healthily challenge one another. And when people are in check with their own emotion and they recognize body language or they ask questions around, how does that sound to you? It seems to me that that might not be a good answer for you, or let's explore that a bit more. I can see that you might be questioning that, or you have some more ideas on that. Paying attention. There's a competency within emotional intelligence called organizational awareness. And it's an amazing thing because this is your ability as an employee or as a leader, or someone in an organization, to know where the decisions are made, where the power is, where the influence is, because it isn't always determined by the hierarchy of the information of the organization. And when you watch a room, you can even on Zoom, you can tell who has the power, who has the influence, who has the last say. And again, you can spot those who might be resistant in speaking up, but you know that they've got something that is a huge and valuable contribution. And again, when you have the skill of emotional intelligence, you are more in tune with the vibe of the room, which means that you can gently encourage others to come forward who might otherwise be kind of bamboozled and overshadowed by the loudest voice.
So that's fascinating and makes complete sense, by the way. And I wrote another kind of additional question to this. So I can see how innovation and collaboration and having diverse groups and the importance of emotional intelligence relates back to the performance of the business. But I'm not sure that I could see, or the users or listeners, I should say, would see for productivity paranoia, which I see that a lot, right? In business in general. How does that impact the business's customers' experience potentially?
It's like a chain of events. So if you can imagine that you need people to respond to customer insights, to customer feedback. You need people to be willing to improve and to change. You also need them to be productive because you need the organization to be agile and to respond and to be productive overall. Now, we know that when employees have autonomy, when they have what we call mastery. So when they're able to have a certain degree of control, when they're able to be really good at the work that they're doing, and when they have purpose, so when they know why they're doing what they're doing for the greater good, they have higher levels of motivation. They are more engaged. I mean, that's the work of Daniel Pink in a book called Drive that
Yep.
many of you may recognize. So autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So if you have someone who's got equal measure of that stuff, they're doing well. If they've got a boss who is either passive aggressive or overtly checking in, 9 o'clock, are you here? 5 o'clock, are you still at work? Sending messages on Slack. Where are you? Where's the thing? Micromanaging. Your autonomy is out the window. That's for sure. Your ability or desire or willingness to master your skill is a bit like, why would I bother? Because I'm likely to get criticized, or I'm likely to see the negative in what I'm potentially going to do, because I don't even know what my boss is going to think about this, because he or she is on my case the whole time. And I think the final point in this is trust. The result of a manager not giving you the space, questioning, checking in, as it has been known in the hybrid environment, means that the employee knows the boss doesn't trust them. And I don't know about any of you, but if you know that someone does not trust you, how do you then behave? You behave very differently than if you have someone who is supportive and trusting and encouraging and empowering and all of those amazing things. So ultimately, it's like a ever decreasing circle. It won't be long once that paranoia, that kind of productivity paranoia kicks in. It's not going to be long before you got a side hustle going on and actually you're applying for other jobs, because no one likes not to be trusted. It just does no good for our status and this thing that's called significance, one of the most important things for human race, being significant. If we lose that position of significance, it's good night.
So that makes so much sense. Now, one more question, and I have a lot of other questions I think would be really valuable, hopefully for the listeners. Is there ever a situation, and I'm thinking maybe the pandemic has caused some of this, where it's complete opposite of this productivity paranoia, meaning you have a management structure that now it's so maybe not checked in, or like in the industries now, like I'm noticing we're starting to go through in technology specifically, we're starting to go through a downturn because of the economy, right? And there's been some really large companies out there that have been doing some major layoffs and things like that. So there might also be this complete opposite of where managers are now doing the jobs of two, or employees are doing the jobs of two or three. And you have this complete, I don't know if apathy is the word, but almost absence, right? And then with the pandemic, you don't have sight because maybe there is more of a hybrid or remote working. Could the same be said for that as far as same outcome potentially? Or,
I'm not sure.
I mean,
I
I know it's a
think,
hard question, but it's.
yeah. So I'm going to answer it a slightly different way. And in the way that I answer it, I hope I answer your question. I think people are hanging in there. And what I mean by that is definitely in the world of customer experience, what we do know is around 20% of time that people spend in businesses are trying to unravel or solve problems that the business has created through its processes and procedures. So imagine that one day a week, you're not doing the things you're paid for, you're sorting out the mess that has come as a consequence of some of the decisions that have been made in the organization. That's burnout time, I'm afraid. That's exhaustion. That is people hanging in there because they're not 100% certain that if they leave, they'll get a better job. I mean, the interesting thing is that there are some incredible roles out there for people. It's just whether they have the belief and the confidence and the energy to put themselves onto the market. So I think that there is another compound factor here, which we mustn't forget. We're out of, in inverted commas, we're out of the pandemic, but our brains are changed as a consequence of that. Our amygdala, the oldest bit that has the emotional center that was is critical for us today, but was really important for us when we really needed to be scared of things like the saber-toothed tiger. That's apparently expanding, and our hippocampus that holds memories is shrinking a bit. And I think that we're just hanging in there, trying to figure out what we want to do. So when I say that, I see a lot of people who have quit without a job to go to because they reckon that just by managing their finances a little bit better and doing something that's lower key, but without all the grief that comes from doing 5 people's jobs or 3 people's jobs, or dealing with a not a very pleasant manager, or not achieving their targets, etc., is a better life. And the final point I just want to add to this, businesses have to start paying attention to the emerging leadership, the people who are in their early to mid 20s, because they will not tolerate overwork, presenteeism, playing the whole culture game, and they will call you and your business out if you think that they will have the corporate DNA that people of my generation used to think was the be all and end all of life. And what I mean by that is you will not have them doing 3 or 4 people's jobs. They will just leave.
So then, which makes a lot of sense, right? So if anything, what could emotional intelligence teach or provide a business for both? You mentioned some of these things, but for that as well, right? So if you could I'm thinking the listeners have some productivity paranoia, they have some innovation collaboration issues, and then they have this other opposite situation, right? People getting burnt out from overwork and all of the things that you just mentioned. So maybe you can share with the listeners today, based off of some of those topics, what would be some tips that they could walk away with?
So there's a whole range of tools out there. So I'm not on commission for any of them, but some of them I've tried and I really think they rock. So some clients that I've had in the past have said, emotion has no place in this organization. We don't do all that fluffy stuff, yada, yada, yada. I'm like, okay, so you're telling me that no one feels any sense of delight and excitement when someone's just got married or someone's had a baby or someone's just got their degree. Oh, yeah, no, we have that. And no one feels any level of stress and everyone feels totally balanced. Oh, no, So the reason why I bring that up is because recognizing that the people that make the organization are emotional creatures is quite a good start. The fact that we are humans and we are filled with amazing chemicals that can make us feel incredible joy and absolute stress and all of the things in between has to be acknowledged, because this is science, right? We know it, and you can ask people how they feel. And there's this amazing thing called the emotional culture deck, which was created by a gentleman who used to be a professional cricketer. He's in New Zealand. It's by a company called Riders and Elephants, I think. And it's simply a deck of cards. Each card has a word on it. There are 2 sets of words, positive and less positive. I have given these packs of cards. In actual fact, I've got one here. These cards, they're just a deck of cards, right? The emotional culture deck.
Okay.
You give this pack to someone you work with. You say, pick out some cards on how you're feeling today. They pick out some cards. Narrow it down to 3. Narrowed it down to 3. And all of a sudden, they're having a conversation about how they're feeling today. How would you like to feel at work? Pick 2 cards. How do you actually feel at work? They pick another 2 cards. How can we get to where you want to, how you want to feel, to what you actually feel right now? This is a game changer, because honestly,
Yeah.
people want to talk about emotion. They don't know how to, they don't know if it's safe. They need some structure around it. They need to know that they won't be shamed, embarrassed, or humiliated. And you can have this informal chat using something like an emotional culture deck. That's one thing that you can do. The other thing you can ask, if you want to, you at the beginning of a team meeting, what 2 things are you grateful for at work this week? Team meeting, super fast, on Post-its. What are you grateful for? The amazing thing about homing in on gratitude, which I'm sure many of you know, is that it knocks anxiety out. You can't feel gratitude and anxiety at the same time. Hooray for that. And gratitude makes you feel good because actually you're recalling something to mind. And if you're able to be grateful for the tiniest acts of kindness that your colleagues have shown to you, you know what's coming. There's going to be more of them. When leaders say what they're grateful for, when managers say what they're grateful for, all of a sudden they become more human and their teams share more, because it is kind of on the cusp of being a bit vulnerable and a little bit courageous because you're saying something that's meaningful. But the great thing is you're creating those emotional connections, because then you can talk about it. I was really grateful when you brought me that cup of tea, because I hadn't stopped working for 3 hours and I was gasping and you could see it. I didn't say anything, but you brought me that cup of tea. And I'm going to tell you now that I worked somewhere where I was working my little socks off and I was in that situation and someone brought me a cup of tea and they said, "You're doing a great job." That was 17 and a half years ago. That is how potent the emotion I felt at that moment in time with that tiny act of kindness, it can happen. So let's get some emotional culture deck. Let's get some gratitude written down. And finally, please celebrate success, even the tiny things.
Mhm.
Individually. You don't even have to make a meeting out of it on your Slack channel, on a Jamboard. Celebrate it. I finished that project. I worked with this amazing team and we smashed it out. Do you know what? We totally messed up, but we learned from it. All of it, warts and all. Let's get some great oxytocin going on, because we'll all feel better from it.
Yeah, those are great tips because I'm thinking they're very easily attainable for businesses or managers that are listening. And what I'm hearing is it would absolutely correlate to how all of those people then feel with their day-to-day jobs as it even relates to customer experience, whether a listener is in the retail business or finance business or technology, right? Everyone's level of customer is a little different. But no matter what, there's marketing teams and they're trying to figure out different ways to service their customers. And if you do these small things internally, I think people are feeling better about what they're doing, right? It sounds like that will just be expressed to their customers as opposed to um, maybe somebody that's had a really bad day or is not being acknowledged or doesn't feel significant, right? And then they're just going through the motion and end customers' result could be
The
impacted.
For sure. And I think to just take that a ramp up. So this is what I've just described to you is individuals working within a team or a manager with a team, bringing reality and life to life, as it were. And a work that I've been doing with a client now, which I've done for many years with many different companies, is an employee telling their customer story, which means they are telling a story about how they tried to help a customer of the business. And if you haven't seen this book, Human Experience by John Sills, get it, because it's got some incredible goosebump. I'm slightly going to cry, I'm slightly going to laugh at people who go the extra mile, who do the meaningful thing for a customer. These are everyday human beings like you and me, but they have made an enormous impact, an enormous impression. They have created a meaningful, never forget moment for a customer by being able to do something that is important to them. And the great thing about this is that the customer not only feels great, but the employee feels even more amazing. And when they share their story of what they did, there's the ripple effect, and there's the opportunity for everyone else to want to do something to feel like that.
And then tell me, or the listeners, I should say, not me, what do you think the businesses may have been doing different, even with emotional intelligence, if you know of that, what do you think that there's some differences that they've been able to?
So it's going to, the one of the fundamental things here, which you're never going to believe because it is so incredibly simple, it is properly listening, but not just listening to the words, it's listening to the tone of the voice, the speed of the speech, the language that's used, the tonality, the spaces between the words that are said. They are properly focusing on what the customer is doing when they are showing up. And this isn't just face to face, this is on the phone, this is in chat. The nuances of our signals we give out when we communicate are incredible. And when you are sensitive to a sigh or an inflection of the voice or the repetition of a particular word, and then you use that to connect better with the customer, or even if you say to the customer, I just want to check that I've understood what you've just said. I really just need to check that I understand what you want from us or what we can do for you. And then you play it back. I have understood that organizations that have brought technology in that increases empathy understanding have not only seen customer satisfaction go up about 23%, they've seen employee satisfaction and comfort go up 66%. So what am I saying here? Because I've got a lot to say. The bottom line is, don't underestimate proper listening. And that's in the moment. And that is also, ladies and gentlemen, when you ask your customer questions in any type of survey, do something about it and tell them somehow, whether it's something on your website or if it's something else in any of your communications, we heard this from you, we're doing something about it. Because we are terrible at repeatedly asking our customers for feedback and then doing nothing about it. And it's destroying the credibility of feedback. It's destroying the opportunity for customers to be heard and for organizations to learn a lesson. The other thing as well that I just want to add to this is I've seen in recent years complaints departments be repositioned within organizations. So rather than being complaints departments, they are business development. Because actually, if you take complaints as a gift to amend, address, and you get a second chance to actually keep this customer, because what we know, and I know that you know this, if you do mess up, but you actually correct it very well, I'm more likely to stay loyal to you than if anything happened ever. We know that. It's called the pratfall effect. We like people that mess up a little bit, but they correct it because we build trust that when something else goes wrong, you're going to have my back.
Right.
So in summary, we have got to listen with all of our senses, and we have got to be able to respond to all of the nuances that these amazing customers give us. We've got to do that. We have got to ensure that the feedback customers give us, we do something with it. And finally, within an organization, we take comment from our customers as a gift, not as a threat. We don't make it difficult for people to complain. We make it easy for them to complain. They know how to do it. And we trust that the customer is bringing this to us, and we don't expect them to jump through hoops of fire in order to get their $10 back. Don't humiliate me, because if you do that, I will never trust you ever again.
Yeah, that is so true. I mean, I know I have an example regularly with I'm in the US, right? So the where I live in Atlanta, Georgia, the United States Postal Service, I don't know what has happened. That maybe they have a hiring problem or a morale problem or something like that. But more and more often, there's things like, okay, I'll get a message saying your package is going to be delivered. And this week, it was like 3 different packages, and you get the tracking number. 2 of those packages were left at the bottom of our stairs, just on top of the mailbox. And we live on a street where it could have been picked up by anyone. They didn't want to walk up the stairs. Another one was left at a neighbor's house instead. And when I went to go try to give feedback about those incidents, it was almost virtually impossible to find a way to provide feedback. And that was and that has happened multiple times, which means I have no trust right now in the local chapter of our post
Yes.
office
Yeah.
because it keeps happening and they don't fix the problem.
Mm.
Right. And so that makes a lot of sense. I know we're coming up on time in a few minutes, so I want to make sure that I kind of come back to, again, your expertise around emotional intelligence. So we had a little chat before this call, and you had mentioned that you wanted to make sure people understood emotional intelligence is not empathy. Could you help me understand what you mean by that?
Yeah. So very often when people empathize, what they do is they project what they're thinking and feeling onto the other person. So you might have been in a situation where you're explaining something, and the person who's meant to be listening to you might say, "Oh yeah, I totally get what you mean. Yeah, my dad had the same." Or, "Oh yeah, I know what you mean. I've been through that too." Or, "Oh yeah, it must be very hard or very sad or very happy or ba ba ba." What's going on there is you're telling your story to me. I'm having a bunch of sensations and emotions about it. And those emotions and sensations I'm having about it is what I think you're feeling. So I'm thinking my thoughts and my emotions, and I'm thinking, well, that must be what you're thinking, because I've interpreted what I've interpreted what you said, and this is the picture that I've got in my mind. Another way of looking at it, so if you can imagine that I am a cine film, I'm a film projector. So you've said something and I've thought flower. So I'm now thinking flower and I'm projecting a flower onto your head, but actually what's in your head is a lion. But because I'm so busy projecting this flower onto you, and I'm not really listening because I'm very busy with my own emotion, I'm never going to know that you have a lion in your head, because I'm not asking you a load of questions to find out what that lion is. So empathy and the whole idea of walking in someone's shoes or standing in someone else's shoes, it's not enough. When you practice the skill of emotional intelligence, you become aware of your own emotions. So when I'm listening to what you're saying, I know that I'm feeling and thinking certain things, but I can park those. I put the flower to one side and I ask you more questions that are open. And I might say, it seems to me that you are frustrated by this particular thing. So I might make a guess at what that territory might be. But the way I word it means you could say, "No, I don't feel like that. I feel like this." Or, "I feel a bit of that, but not quite." So you're far more able, through the types of questions that I ask you, to describe in far more detail how you're feeling, which will be quite different to the assumption that I have made and I have stayed with. That is
So then,
why,
oh, I was sorry. So how does this come back to a business and why business, and I'll say at the upper level management, why should they care? Because I feel like the people that, whether they listen to their clients, right, or not, through being aware, they may know how to respond. But why should a business care?
Because you can make decisions faster. You can be more confident that you have support and backing because there is absolute clarity in how people feel about something. So it's Brené Brown who says, to be clear is kind, to be unclear is unkind. The number of assumptions and biases that we have, if I say something at a board meeting and I'm watching the faces and the body language around the room, I can tell you whether people either get it or they're not over keen on it or they love it. And it takes courage to say, Hillary, I'm sensing that you might not be sure about what I've said, because I can see from her body language that she's not looking over keen. It's then up to her to describe through her emotional intelligence how she's feeling about that thing. And when people practice emotional intelligence, they have a wide range of language they can use to describe how they're feeling. And so they're prepared to go there and tell you what it is that's going on. Now, how often have you gone to board meetings where there's nodding around the room and then the real decisions are made in the corridor, which is not what you agreed in the room? That's one thing. Secondly, how often is there tension in the room because no one has the courage to actually call someone out for misbehavior or for lack of decisiveness or not getting the work done? And again, this is about treating people like adults, having respectful but challenging and healthy conversation without someone slamming the table, shifting from their chair, walking out the door and slamming it. And I've seen that at board as well. Because when you are able to manage your emotions for the greater good of the organization, that is where proper grounded business is done.
And that makes so much sense. So then I just probably have one or two last things before we end the call today. But if you can share with us where businesses, like an experience you've had personally, where you went into maybe a business, you don't have to tell us any names or even the type of business if you don't want to share any of that. Give us an example of, here was the prior state, right? And some things that they were challenged with. And I'm even thinking it must be hard to overcome decision makers to even want to invest in a program like this sometimes, right? So, even just trying to convince them how important this is. So help us understand an example of where business, you had the opportunity to see what they might be doing that they need to improve, and you saw some outcomes. And what were those outcomes after?
So I won't disclose the name of the company, but I will say that I worked with a bunch of engineers. They did actually happen to be of a certain age, and they did actually happen to be all men. And they did behave in a particular way, which meant that they were curious, very intelligent, and slightly skeptical of anything called emotional intelligence. So I didn't call it that. That's the truth. I invited them to get involved in a personality profile thing under the guise of, when we get the results from this, you'll be able to communicate in a different way, which will probably enable you to save more lives. No one can argue with that, because these engineers were influencing the infrastructure that had high risk. So they
Okay.
weren't arguing with that. So they did these tests. Great, first step. And these tests, they were insights discovery, actually. So the insight discovery is very simple set of, well, it's actually quite complicated, all the words underneath. But the bottom line is, you come out of a set of colours in a particular order. And not surprisingly, there were lots of similarities between the group, but the narrative within the reports were quite different. So first opportunity, know yourself. They read these reports, they read them with their partners, with their very close friends. Is this me? I don't believe this is me. Yes, it is. Oh, okay. self-awareness, emotional self-awareness, little bits in there about how they lead, little bits in this particular report about how they are when they're very stressed versus when they're quite relaxed. Interesting. Intellectually, high IQ, interesting. I didn't know that about me. Okay, great. The issue we were trying to deal with was there were a couple of projects that they just weren't solving fast enough for whatever reason. So we did a few exercises around the results of this report. They then understood why some people wound them up and some people they really liked working with, and why there was procrastination in some areas, and there was high energy and forceful behavior in some other quarters of this particular group. And then I brought them together and we used some Lego. And I asked them to build the problem. And they playfully teased each other about their personality profiles and how actually they would each show up. And they built this thing, then they destroyed it, then they built it again. They were relaxed. They weren't in their they were obviously in a conscious state because they were awake, but they weren't in their, oh my God, they've got to find out what the square root of, and I've got to do some maths on that. It wasn't about that. It was about hands-on. So we know that our brains are wired differently when we do things with our hands. We process information differently because we've got to get the information in our head, and then we've got to get our hands to actually act the thing out. So that's a different process step altogether. Can't remember what it's called. Sorry about that. But they solved this problem very easily. We moved on to the second one. In half a day, they'd solved it. And that was very rewarding for them because they wanted to get to a result because they knew it would save lives. And what they then understood, because I told them, is actually they've started the journey of emotional intelligence because they have greater emotional awareness. And through this game, they managed their emotions very carefully because they were mindful when someone started getting a bit angsty and another person started getting frustrated and the other person started taking over, how the dynamics worked in a very different way. So here were a group of people who were trying to sort something out on paper. They then knew a bit more about who they were and why they wound each other up and how they glued. Then you put them in a situation with that background information where they use their hands. They solved two problems and probably, I like to think, would have saved some more lives.
Yeah, that's amazing. So thank you for sharing that. I think that I'm kind of like even stumbling because I'm like, wow, that's so clearly a really good example of how a business could practice or help have the skills of emotional intelligence and it directly impacts something. And you were talking about engineers and ultimately the customer experience is saving lives, which is a pretty big thing compared to marketing to get more business. Right? So thank you for sharing that. I know we were up on time here. So I really just want to say that I really value what you shared today. I think you shared a lot of great practices for businesses. I think if any listener is just now rethinking, right, how they can approach their customer experience, whether it's marketing, whether it's your employees, whether it's external. I think just even a couple of those tips, I think would probably be very, very valuable, right? Just walking away with that, like even 20% of what they heard today. So I really want to thank you for that. Is there any last things that you would like to share with the audience today before we end?
The last thing I would like to share is doing little things frequently. I used to make New Year's resolutions and then be shocked at myself that I'd actually not continued with the New Year's resolutions in February. So I read a book called Atomic Habits, and it changed everything. Because if you just do something tiny and you keep repeating it every day, so even if you wrote down in a journal just for 2 minutes every day, and you did that every day for 20 days or 30 days or 60 days, you will find that you will be a bit calmer. You'll have greater self-awareness because you will see patterns in what you're writing. You will start to see that you're developing your emotional granularity through the language that you're using, the language that you're trying. So I encourage you to take tiny steps. I encourage you to take what Susan David calls in her book, Emotional Agility, I think it is, tiny tweaks. If you set yourself up with a massive ambition, yes, I'm going to become more emotionally intelligent by the end of next week, you'll give it a go and then you'll burn out. Please make this a new habit. If you'd like to, just do something for 2 minutes every single day. And I reckon that you will see long-term change. So that's my invitation to you. Just try that.
That's great. That seems attainable too. And I'm actually feverishly writing things down. I'm like, yeah, those are great tips. So hopefully the listeners feel the same way. Well, again, thank you, Sandra. And to finish this up, again, I'm Heather Scher. I work with Cinch. This podcast is brought to you by Cinch. It's a platform that enables you, business, to create mobile experiences that your customers will hopefully love and be able to connect with them. And taking away some of these tips, you'll even be able to connect in a different way, hopefully. And really, thank you again. I really appreciate your time, Sandra.
It's been a pleasure. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to just go on about something I'm very passionate about. I just want more people to see the difference it can make, not only in business, but to their personal lives too. So thank you for the opportunity.
You are welcome. So again, Ei Evolution, look her up. Great information on her site as far as her consultancy. Have a great day.
That's it for this episode of CX Education. Thanks for joining us. This show is brought to you by Cinch, the technology company that helps you create mobile experiences your customers love. Did you enjoy the episode? Then make sure to subscribe to CX Education wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit cinch.com/podcast to get instant access to all the latest episodes.